Hello everyone, today we talk about the Mos Italicus, that is to say the Italian jurisprudence in the 16th century, the one that we have already documented having consolidated in the late Middle Ages from the great revival of Roman law, and that had affected widely the same Europe. I already made a video about the Mos Gallicus, that is to say the reception in fact of this jurisprudence in France, with all the different declination of the same, and we arrived at an interesting point because I began this series about history of law years ago when a guy asked me something about, I remember, I think pillaring, because the only relevant thing about medieval law should be pillaring, right? And I interpreted it rather like I needed, given that I had also in my university background as the affected the need, the right moment of starting a series about medieval law, right? And I have basically covered everything about medieval law in general, right? So this part, this series of the cycle is going to be exhausted. We still have to talk essentially about the same jurisprudence in Germany and in Spain. So we sort of complete a bit the picture. Then, of course, we will keep talking about medieval law on a regular basis from, let's say, other parts of the cycle, because it is really a much more important topic than one could think just coming from a regular pop culture, let's say, medieval historical interest. I must confess that when I studied it was not so, say, I understood how important it was immediately. Just I was not specializing into that and so on, and mostly, at least in my curriculum, that was something heavily connected with diplomatics, with paleography, etc. So all stuff which, frankly, taking the way at least they were taught and studied at the time, I was not excessively interested in. But over time, of course, I treasured the fact of having gained my modest experience as the, let's say, most attentive of you know. I actually studied economics before bailing out and starting with history, where before I had also studied a bit of law and had failed miserably, telling the truth, but for the simple reason I had not studied it, as a matter of fact. And yes, it has a lot to do with memory, with very precise definitions, etc. But generally speaking, it was I thought to study law back in the day when I was like in high school. Ideally, would have liked to study law at a point, or medicine, because I do come after all a family of doctors, and at least I became a doctor myself through one with my PhD in history. But I sort of maintained this awareness of the discipline, and over time, and especially thanks to Schwerpunkt, I revisited my sources, my material, gaining a very positive impression from it. That is to say, having really passed through again the entire Middle Ages, even though in a general way I think was quite productive. So let's take a look at the Mos Italicus. So you say 16th century, so this is not the Middle Ages, is it? It's not, but I remember that around 3 years ago I was making a video just in these days, and I remember it for other reasons, by the way, that was illustrating the same 18th century absolute Reformation. Let's say then we more recently talked about the French Revolution. We went through, I think I made a video about the Code of Napoleon. And in any case, this sort of later phase I think is quite important to exemplify still what it means to erase properly the concept of the existence of a modern era, let's say between, in fact, the Middle Ages and the contemporary one, right? That begins, if we want to have a very juridical definition of that, exactly with the Code of Napoleon. It's not much the French Revolution as such, but it is exactly the moment in which the state becomes the sole source of law, at least in civil law, but with some consequences that, of course, would have significantly altered the state building, and so by osmosis also common law. And we have, of course, observed through the history of law how practically communities were ruled, governed, organized. I think this is vital, especially to understand for people that have a very contemporary based idea of power, right? When, say, I noticed the first things among the students, say, of the beginning, their university career, even those that study that want to become medievalists, is that they have a great difficulty in understanding the fact that there wasn't like a state like in the one we live today, right? With this enormous, disproportionate, incredible power, right? This is the mere concept that, even if you, when you are on the territory of sovereign state, even if you do not accept, of course, to be within its, under its rule, right, within its boundaries, you still are anyway, right, for that state, of course, but de facto with the actual means of political and territorial control that this entails. There are many people who are paranoid about this, but it's not really a matter of choice, right? And that's why before I was saying, yes, there are substantial juridical and institutional differences between, obviously enough, common and civil law, but this doesn't mean that factually the power of the state is of that proportion anyway, and that this corresponds with unprecedented quality of life in the history of mankind, that, of course, if properly, say, and fully exploited by spiritually built up people, would be, a paradise, right? And it is actually what all the great rulers back in the Middle Ages were striving, and largely and successfully to achieve. So I realized that this series may not be the most exciting, at least I get it from, and it's not entirely true, right? But through views, I realize that you want to see more sort of ethnic, military stuff and so on. But this is perhaps one of the single most important in absolute terms, because if you do not understand the grip that authority had historically on communities, you can't quite understand any of that sort of, in fact, really political identity and military capacity, and miss an enormous chunk of the Middle Ages, right? Otherwise, it's just like video gaming. You start, I don't know, with a battle, right, with your own coordinates, your own setup. You do not have any idea, of course, whatever could have produced that, and you assume that that's the Middle Ages, on the basis of whatever fantasy you're practically building up, making up at that point. The Mos Italicus is also particularly relevant because, as we have explained in our videos about medieval law, the Italians had revived Roman law, right? This process had been quite long. It had been natural because of the increased need of political, institutional, juridical, negotiable, commercial, if you want, interactions. This was particularly evident in a place like Italy that had essentially the highest per capita wealth around there, which means that this was not just a very rich country, but wealth was quite evenly distributed, and so people had an enormous deal of private and public interactions. Also juridically, it was a vast, in fact, juridical apparatus historically since the very beginning of the Middle Ages. Like from, even if you look from the Romans to the Goths to the Longobards, there had, and we made videos about this, there had always been basically an unmatched Europe-wide, I think Europe-wide actually, recurrence to law, to written culture, to urbanization. And during the High Middle Ages, with the investiture controversy, especially the Holy Roman imperial need to sort of oust the papacy, like in Constantinople, which was exactly the place from which the Roman law that we're looking at, that is essentially the Justinian Code, that in turn was essentially a refinement of the Theodosian one. So the subordination of the bishop of the papacy to the emperor, right? So it's obvious that, for example, that's where the famous Constitutio Habita of Frederick Barbarossa comes from. That's why the Bolognese Studium had also these privileges from the empire. Eventually the same papacy, in order to buy consensus, would provide them as such. We really made lots of videos, especially about medieval universities that deal in practice also with these juridical issues and why these centers were so important, right? Italy was the center of medieval law in Europe. Paris was the one of theology, and these were essentially the two big poles of European university culture, right? Higher culture. There were many other universities, but say Bologna or Padua, etc., were centers of excellence, like still today, in virtue of this very old tradition. Specialized, in fact, in this, say, having this particular bias of having as a goal the reconstruction of Roman law, but not only that, because sometimes we think that this would have been a mere recovery of that law. This is not true, right? This was actually a need stemming from the fact that the already very complex juridical system used by the Italians, that was fundamentally at that point the old Germanic law, and mostly the Longobards one that was still in use, in fact, at the time. In fact, it's the Longobards law that really prompted its jurists to recover Roman law, but there had been also the imperial laws, the feudal ones, the customary ones. And at a certain point, given the social complexity, that was not enough. They needed something bigger, with much more fixed institutions, something to make work a much bigger system. And Roman law provided that, except that was Roman law. It was essentially the Perpetua Sanctio that Theodosius had affirmed. The Theodosian Code had been affirmed during essentially the 15th century. That had been affirmed in late antiquity. That had a very different society from the medieval, especially the Italian one, and that which responded, in fact, the latter which responding to it as let's say, first, again, a Roman law needed to essentially fill in the gaps of the juridical of law in the first place, like that could say in those cases which the pre-existing juridical system could not cover, could not discipline, because it had not been presented as a social reality. And as we will repeat now, the Italian juridical science had remained particularly connected with practical issues, right? Roman law was recovered to solve problems. And as you know, after the let's say the literal, historical, philological, linguistic recomposition of the Libri Legalis, etc., the Italian jurists had not limited themselves to those, but had began to produce an enormous jurisprudence based on essentially the school of the commentarists that were these lawyers adding literally comments to the various Libri Legalis and creating an enormous, or much bigger, and that tells you also how the system was more developed even than the Roman one of the time, to discipline, right, to teach how to interpret this law and how to apply it in a different world where, of course, there wasn't quite the same Roman Empire than before, and at least an emperor with the same prerogatives, and very different political communities, and so on. So this favored, by the way, an enormous, let's say, proliferation of juridical acquisitions that were eventually, in turn, consolidated and acquired as the main points of reference for the same tribunals to actually administrate justice. So this is again a mechanism that went on for half of a millennium at this point. And so when we look at the Renaissance here, the 16th century, we realize that the Italian juridical science, despite being vibrant, had remained fundamentally conservative, or it had remained faithful to that traditional address. It had not basically needed to open itself to new methodological frames. Part of the reason is that, as you know, Italy was not unified politically. So, as we've seen in the video about the Mos Gallicus, for example, France had sort of very different interests, right? They were revolving mostly as a juridical science around the monarchy, and a hell of a monarchy with a state, with an administrative, a massive administrative system already at the time, which really was also the most complex in Europe for like just as a true state, right? The Italians at this point preserved, however, that truest and constant attention to the concrete social reality, right? In other countries, exactly because of the power of the monarchy, this, say, the juridical science had been leaning towards a sort of more ideological and omnicomprehensive, say, institutional address that had to be backed by the jurists that were in many ways also opposite to kings, but at some point also backing them. And so it was mostly this iron arm between the ruler and the parliament. In Italy, you have all these various states that work in a relatively simpler way, and they do not need to alter fundamentally this very praised also internationally juridical science, considering that Roman law from Italy had spread during the Middle Ages and remaining fundamentally until very late in time, in spite of this various national modifications in great part of Europe, right? So much so that we will see now that was a broader international jurisprudence that looked at what jurists in other countries did, because at this point you have the print, you have really this true humanistic culture that had broadened dramatically the same inter-European horizons. And so it was important to observe what, especially when Roman law was the base of this dispositions, this or that scholar had found out. And we will see it now, because this was true for the Italians looking abroad and the same other foreigners looking at Italy and each other, etc. And so we think about just the increase of commerce, right, within the same continent at this point. So this attention to the concrete real society was a very important starting point for emphasizing strengthening even the definition of the many concrete situations in which each part of a juridical negotiation was to be found, and for which the numerous, and as contrasting interpretation of the previous norm to the contemporary one were cited. Right? What does it mean? It means that the authority of jurists had been in the past so great, especially in the Italian jurisprudence, that these people, first of all, were extremely powerful. Right? States needed these men to properly define what the prerogatives of the state really was, what could be done, what could not be done. As we will see, we have already seen that, right? We've covered that all in depth. Within the Holy Roman Empire, what were the prerogatives of the emperor, of the papacy, of the various communes, of the various states that had been emerged and consolidating, and these big names, right, that now were fully adopted essentially in an ancien regime, crystallized hierarchy, remained the obvious beacons of juridical light, right? And what was what Italian jurisprudence was criticized for is that it would have often exceeded with all these doctrinary recallings. It's as if these guys had remained habituated to the commentarist school, for which there was a norm of Roman law, and then this jurist had said that, and so that other jurist cited that, but then another had come by, and these very books written by jurists, so not even the law, unless this was in fact adopted by the same tribunals, was consulted every time, because that guy had been that important and had highlighted one specific aspect of that norm as opposed to another. And so lawyers would, judges, etc., would get pretty thorough in this, and as a form of pride, like of having studied this enormous juridical background that really had, even just from a quantitative point of view, defined the quality of the Italian universities, mostly teaching law, and that's how universities had been born in practice. The French did not like this very much. They tended to simplify things because, of course, they had that more centralized state. So the Mos Gallicus was pretty critical of all these citations and took a different path. Now, a great contribution to the Mos Mos, by the way, means way, right? In case you wonder, so it's the Italian way, basically, of the juridical doctrine. Came from the jurisprudence of the supreme tribunals, right? In the early modern age, you have the flourishing, like in Germany, of the Reichskammergericht. You have all these, firmer sort of ancien regime, centralizing in sort of modern fashion tribunals that have to discipline and in an increasingly concentrated fashion the administration of justice uniformly, or at least with this superior position in all the various territories, right? And so in all the various states of the Italian peninsula, this was the case. In the Duchy of Savoy, you had the Turinese Senate that was reorganized in 1560. Then the one of Chambéry, this was in Savoy proper, across the Alps, essentially in France, that however belonged to the duchy. This was the old capital, in fact, properly of Savoy, instituted in 1559. In the Duchy of Milan, you have the Senate established at the beginning of the 16th century by the same King of France, Louis XII, when the French, during the Italian Wars, had occupied Milan. Then you have all these tribunals known as rotas, right? Operating in Genoa. So these are centers of the various Genoese Republic, in Mantua with the Gonzaga. The latter was substituted in 1571 by a Senate proper. This entailed different reforms, however, of the same institution in practice. You have one rota in Lucca, one in Florence, one in Siena. As we'll see now, also the Papal States were rather active for different reasons, right? First of all, they were the lands of the Church, but they also were important centers of medieval and, of course, at this point, Renaissance culture. You have the one of the Rota of Perugia. We made a video about medieval Perugia months ago. Within the Papal States, you have the same Bologna, the Dotta Bologna, learned Bologna, which is where this whole thing had been born in the first place on a European scale. Then you have Avignon, that, as you know, was in France, right, in the at the the border historical of the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France, and it would remain in papal hands for centuries. You have other centers such as Macerata in the Marches, Ferrara, with the Este, while in the same Rome, the Sacra Rota, right, the Holy Wheel, let's say, worked both as supreme court of the universal church. So this was the bigger deal. And as a superior temporal tribunal of the same papal states. Then you have, in the Duchy of Parma and Piacenza, the Supreme Council of Justice. In Naples, you have different supreme tribunals, such as the Holy Royal Council, the Great Court of the Vicary, the Royal Chamber of the Sommaria, and the Collateral Council. This just in Naples. Sicily had the Magna Regia Curia, the Tribunal of the Royal Patrimony, that of the Royal Monarchy, the Consistorium of the Holy Royal Conscience. So, yes, southern Italy was essentially at this point under the Spanish, but it had already developed this, as we'll see in the end, this robust local juridical system that had really a hell of a legacy. Actually, the most important, as we have seen in the series, throughout the series, about medieval Europe, because the Sicilian kings from the time of the Normans and Frederick II had been the only ones that had basically succeeded in a European kingdom to issue a law that was not merely the preservation of a pre-existing customary one, but literally legislating a true royal law that could add itself naturally to fill the gaps of pre-existing jurisprudence, not quite to superimpose to one of the subjects. But this, as an exception, gives you already the dimension of how complicated it had been historically to centralize power. This will not, succeed until the 18th and the 19th century, historically, anywhere, right? So just think about that. So all these tribunals in Italy adopted fundamentally the traditional interpretative model, right? These all that had been never under the same ruler, but they shared this Italian juridical tradition. So they framed the question as it was submitted to their judgment in the subjective cases and in the theoretical categories that had been elaborated by the traditional juridical science, and then they would adopt a solution that would avail itself of the particular, norm of particular law, right? Because this was not eliminated. There was always a local community that had specific laws, and so you had to deal with this in judgment. And this went along with the interpretation of, let's say, that the category, right, of the case had been established by juridical science. Because in practice, that's how it had happened. There were various institutions, different categories within which you had to frame the various cases, and on the basis of traditional juridical science, you had to discipline to judge, right? Thus, the courts would cite the different interpretations proposed by the jurists of various generations of previous centuries, and among them, they would pick the one that was deemed to be more pertinent, more effective for the solution. Sometimes it was the same courts to introduce original elements in the reading of the norms. This is why these tribunals were so important, because in spite of the traditional weight, let's say, it was always possible to say, well, look, this is a different case, and so we have the authority to judge in a way that can serve to jurisprudence later on, just like nowadays, even in civil law, and bringing this contribution of originality to the evolution of juridical thinking in the process. And since all were, say, based on the canonic Roman law, the sentences of the supreme tribunals began even more to be part of a common patrimony of doctrine, and they were in fact cited exchangeably by the same tribunals together with doctrine in a sort of jurisprudential globalization that entailed all the Italian states. Right? This is very important, also considering that Italy passes for, say, the chronically disunited, right, country. But as a matter of fact, the juridical evolution in the states had not just been particularly homogeneous, just like communal civilization, like all the political, institutional, military systems that they had, but it was being consolidated at this time within the entire country further, and sort of this ever more national character. In fact, it wasn't even the same Italian jurists that were cited in such Italian interpretation local tribunals. The German, Spanish, and even the French contributions actually appear currently in the deliberations of these courts. Right, so you understand, even a European, Western European frame in which all these various countries are ever more nationally recognized from a juridical point of view. The decisions of the Italian Supreme Tribunals were collected and commented on by numerous jurists since the beginning of the 16th century. The oldest are the Decisiones of the Neapolitan Holy Royal Council. This work was edited by Matteo de Flitto, and it appeared in Naples already since 1499. Right? Knowing, by the way, in this fashion, a great spread of the same doctrine. This literary genre, by the way, cited the one of, let's say, consulting jurisprudence that had affirmed itself since the last centuries of the Middle Ages, and that now was being expressed in unitary collections, also thanks to, in fact, the printing press, and this naturally had a major impact on the further spread of these works, also beyond the particular institutional reality in which the jurisprudence had expressed itself. In other words, ever more people were interested in these juridical sides, and they were sort of elaborating on it also for broader philosophical, politicological, historical reasons. Both the collection of decisions and the one of consilia, so this sort of consultancy literature, added themselves, given their success, to the works of doctrine to extend further this enormous, it was an enormous amount of works, right? This was not just a few works. This had been already a huge thing ever since Roman law had first been rediscovered. At this point, all the, let's say, think about the stereotypes about the old ancien regime sort of enormity of laws, of little aspect with these lawyers, of the entire libraries covered in dust to consult this or that norm that could find. It was really like that, right? And these, aside from the stereotype, these guys actually knew how to handle that, actually studied this stuff, they knew that, they applied, and they worked with that, right? They weren't sitting just by saying, I'm just a lawyer, and so I'm so powerful and rich and whatever. They were, because they were really that skilled and necessary and experienced. And it was, needless to say, here I'm skipping it a bit, but a fierce competition among all these various jurists, because of course, it was equally important, like to implement these ideas, the certain intuitions, etc., for the various disputes that arose nationally, internationally, statally. So this could even be seen, together with the Italian Renaissance, as a sort of Bolognese revival, right? What had been the great medieval school of the commentarists now was sort of enriched by new contributions at every generation of jurists. Consider we've talked about sort of the scale of sources production throughout history. At this point, the world had been writing and publishing ever more, and that offered to judges, lawyers, and just people who wanted to know about the juridical science an enormous material from which to draw for concrete life, and the exercise of one's rights. So these two works, the Decisiones and the Consilia, as they were known in Latin, reinforced furthermore the strong connection between doctrine and properly the praxis of law that the Mos Italicus was traditionally after, right? Strengthening this effort of reading law in a rational level in all the different aspects of the concrete cases. As we've seen, the Italian jurists never completely closed themselves to the the cultural instances of humanism. For example, there was a great success during the same 16th century to the literary genre of the treatises. These were essentially monographies dedicated to the single themes, literary genre that medieval doctrine had known already, and had been used, in fact, by the same masters in this of the Renaissance. The treatise offered essentially a greater insight on a given subject, right? Conciliating the analysis and the rational reason of the varied reality of praxis in all its particulars, and with the construction of a unitary and organic frame of the doctrine. And they touched on the most varied themes. For example, the theoretical ones, such as the fundamental principles of law, the forms of interpretation, the manifestations of contractual will, single titles of the Libri Legalis that were, after all, the basis of Roman law itself, institutional problems, also a very high level, right? These jurists weren't just, separated from politics, from all the things that were going on in Europe. Definitely were quite dramatic, to say the least, and microscopic in the 16th century. For example, the imperial, papal, royal power as such, personal status, such as the one of the noblemen, of the clergy, of women, of the soldiers, of the infidels, right? All the slaves, right, especially that were being revived with the war against the Ottomans, the serfs, the unregulated people of any kind, people even with illnesses, minors, contracts. You could really find everything at this point published, discussed, and giving further inspiration for further thought, right? So this is in many ways also the definite expansion of the modern age, of course. In these monographies, the fragmentarity and multiplicity that in practice would characterize the topic, or the law in examination as many subjective situations of the parts, right, of the juridical relations were reconstructed with extreme meticulosity, right? Together with the same interpretation expressed by doctrine and jurisprudence of the supreme tribunals concerning each of the aspects of the theme, and say this enormous and as detailed material was framed within a coherent and unitary manner according to a tendentially rational order. After all, this was also Renaissance Italy. This was essentially one of the single most developed parts of the world. To say the least, Italian was the same language of modern Europe, and so aside from the fact that, of course, juridical science wrote in Latin, it was, say, also their work as Italian jurists that was spreading further these ideas in other countries that were observing how things were working there. And the ultimate goal, after all, of these juridical science was quite traditional, in as much as it was trying to make sense of the whole from multiplicity, right? The tendency that we see as a modern concept, but had already been existing with universal powers in the Middle Ages, to bring the world back together, right, with a single discipline, was still alive. I mean, that's why they had been recovering Roman law, among the other things, and or how this later, let's say, Italian jurisprudence had, of course, affirmed, because just of the prestige also of the classics at this point of the Renaissance in general, in spite of the fact that, again, during the Middle Ages there was not an intention of, say, sticking to Roman law, as they weren't just sticking properly, as we've seen even today, because they in fact cared about practice, they cared about criticism, they cared about this interpretation of the law. And this was fitting overall in Italy, that was basically the only country in Europe devoid of religious, confessional, and properly religious wars, right? Historically, this is a very important thing. It was also the same center of the Roman Empire, was still, say, the second major country within the Holy Roman Empire. It had this extraordinary importance. It was ever more connected with, as we've seen, the power of the big in Europe, maintained this centrality and sort of traditional tendency towards a universal ideal, right? So in this way, the same humanistic instances that we have commented on recently, even just in a spiritual sense, were actually received, right, in the say, rationalization, but meant as a true wisdom that could allow man to solve problems, to fix the same evil in the world, right? The same sins, right? Making justice had been the first prerogatives of the emperors and of any ruler. So it's obvious, as we've seen, that all these tribunals were ever more connected with the affirmation of a stronger power locally. Then, of course, the 16th century was definitely for Europe most definitely not the best for the strengthening of universal authorities. But at least the attempt was there. The fact that this was, again, the most Catholic country had definitely a meaning. As we've seen, treatises on the most different topics were produced. For example, marriage, dowry, successory rights, possession, the dominium, the iura in re aliena, the mandatory relations, their elementary, say, their essential elements, the single contracts. And between 1583 and 1586 in Venice you have, for the first time, the publishing of a collection in 18 volumes known as Tractatus Universi Juris, that of course is quite eloquent in that sense. So thanks to the, let's say, the Venetian Renaissance, the fact that this was also a very independent city even from the Counter-Reformation, the fact that this was also a major trade center, so a quite international place. There was the idea of publishing this essentially opera omnia of, at least, what the entire say covering of law from this critical point of view, which is enormous, right? There were other collections promoted during the 16th century that spread as such throughout all the European states, in which the doctrine of jus commune was recognized. So the treatise, as a literary genre, constituted the literary form, in fact, in which the scholars of, for example, mercantile law or penal law preferred to consult, right, whenever they had to truly deal with the new problems were coming up to discipline this increased say trade and wealth, etc., in especially the international relations. Hence the jus mercatorum, so the law of the merchants, the customary law of the merchants that had already been born, of course, in the Middle Ages, and specifically in the Italian communes, together with accounting, banking, etc. So this is the reason, again, why Italy had been the most important country as far as legal studies were concerned. This had been born unitly for the regulation of commercial activities, and with all evidence it was rooted in practice and articulated in a very wide plurality of cases. And within it, however, there were certain general juridical figures that had began to just to emerge by themselves, right, spontaneously through sheer practice, such as, for example, the exchange letter, commendam, limited partnership, the insurance on the goods, on the traded goods, the warrant document. So, lot of very relevant commercial negozia, let's say. And the commentarists, in particular Baldo degli Ubaldi, one of the most famous, in fact, medieval jurists, had started already a scientific reading of the rules, which in the last centuries of the Middle Ages we find really widely spread all over Europe, right? This is to say how important Italian jurisprudence had been so far, and so how especially this commercial, not just juridical, but also economical models had been fundamentally dominating the continent, because it had all started from the most active Italian city-states. And between the 16th and the first half of the 17th century, we have the publishing of the first important treatise, the one, for example, of Bartolomeo Stracca from Ancona, in fact, a very important maritime republic, known as the De Mercatura Seu Mercatore, which in Latin means about essentially about commerce, about of the merchant, right? This is dated to 1553. Then we have Sigismund Scaccia from Rome, writing the De Commercis et Cambio, dating to 1619. The other by the Genoese Raphael della Torre, the Tractatus de Cambis. So here it is about commerce, exchange. The latter treatise dating to 1649. And these works essentially managed to provide with a unitary literature, all that plurality of cases, of the usages that were followed by the merchants in their business. A reading that, by the way, provided also with a law that expressed in an immediate and clear fashion the subjective, say, the present subjective frame that had essentially been with this hallmark of the Justinian discipline, as much as in the interpretation of the same doctrine by the commentarists. So much so that this became traditionally not the law of the acts of commerce, but the law of the merchants. You understand how important this really was, because this stemmed from the very guts of the Bolognese tradition. That is to say, this is not about, let's say, a superior authority imposition on how commerce must be carried out, so that the merchants have to simply adapt to that. But this is exactly how the merchants themselves have regulated this law, and now we formalize it into juridical science. This is an incredibly traditional thinking, right? And it tells you how even effective this was, because these were, again, the places where commerce had literally spread the most, and the same jurisprudence had immediately sort of regulated all these issues. So definitely a place where you want to get exactly that kind of regulation. Concerning the studies of penal law, we have to remember that they had, say, not been that numerous in medieval doctrine, in part because authority, in part communities were in part to settle matters from within themselves, right? Like a bit of mafia concept. And even when the monarchies had affirmed themselves, communities were saying, but we have these privileges, we have these customs, there is all this, in fact, customary law that this is the one for which the sovereign has to, that the sovereign has to defend itself, and not modify that much. But in the 16th century, with the increasing centralization of power, there is a change in penal law. In fact, especially because of this new commitment of princes and monarchs in criminal discipline, the jurists began to get invested in parallel in the same. In particular, we observe in Italy Julius Clarus, that was the judge of the Senate of Milan, Tiberius Deciani, that was a professor at the University of Padua, the Roman Prosperus Farinaccio, Egidio Bossi, that was also judge of the Milanese Senate. You have, interestingly enough, also a Belgian, Jos Damhouder. So you understand, of course, there were lots of foreigners in Italy, and as such, as we've seen, there was a quite international exchange, to say the least, with all these, this legal theories. And this treatise offered a first unitary presentation of a matter strongly connected to practice and regulated largely by the usages, with an interpretation that was truly more original than the Justinian norms, and then which certain new, in fact, theoretical categories were built, capable of framing in an orderly fashion the laws and customs relative to the nature and the repression of the criminal facts. By the way, in the 16th century, some juridical faculties began to insert penal law in their curricula. In Bologna, this happened as early as 1509. You have the first classes on the jus criminale that were fully regularized in 1572, while in Padua you have a lectura criminalium appearing in 1540, right? So this evidently was aimed at forming jurists that would have essentially worked in the increasingly more powerful princely courts, right, to discipline cases of, again, ever greater seriousness, right? So that it's not just like in the Middle Ages where the Lord, yes, has to obey the emperor, has to obey the king, etc., but has an abundant sort of force capacity within its own subject communities. You have here the state gradually beginning to take over, because this again would not be complete, but in 300 years, right? But it's already a big deal that it appears and it starts becoming a thing. Naturally, there is also a historiographical point, that is to say, how much do we actually know about how the say 16th century Italian tribunals worked, right, or any other for that matter, such long time ago, right? There are, just like for any other historical branch, like opinions, sort of how this practically happened, and this other scholar thinks another thing, and this other another. So there was a tendency in the past to believe that law would have sort of simply declined at this point by the legislative will of the single princes, right? And so the fact that the common, say the evolution of system of common law would have affirmed itself as first source of law, right? In the same Roman one. And this this is not correct. Today we don't think this is what happened. At the beginning of the early modern age, surely there wasn't a capacity of monarchs to simply impose their will in Europe on their countries from a juridical point of view, right? It was against all what, again, the prior tradition had been. There is no doubt, again, that their authority increased, but there isn't really a situation of full homogenization under the rule of the monarch, or even a sort of passivity of the lawyers of the same communities. Because this is also another important factor to consider, that lawyers had, and especially Italy is that great example of this, that had not appeared because there had been a monarch that had created them, right? They had appeared by themselves, and then at best monarchs began to avail themselves of them. And these lawyers, of course, had emerged from the various communities of the land, and so they were also bringing themselves, as also, by the way, people of pretty high status. Remember, in the Middle Ages, these guys received knighthood as doctors of law, so they were enormously important again. They had their own saying, and they could be quite politically, of course, supportive of this concentration of power, but also opposite to that, right? And so this idea is now abandoned, or at least resized dramatically, right? Princely legislation is much more limited, and it also intervenes in relatively few fields, such as the ones we have listed before, for example, the penal ones, but also the processual ones, because at the end of the day, this is the one in which it was more directly involved. After all, the same princes, yes, were striving to get more power through these juridical means, but ideally they would have preferred not say, just to have communities obeying them, and not having to also ask even more to maintain these tribunals, to have to impose this uniformation in the trials, etc. So it's obvious that the monarch intervenes initially just for the most important, say, reasons of public order, of very big crimes and things like that, right? So the fact, again, that the processual and penal area was also marginal, this enormous, especially boom of juridical sources at this point, it shows how, after all, the monarchy was respecting the many and different local, regional customs, and just letting jurisprudence framing autonomously these various laws within the Justinian and canonistic law, right? Which is, again, why Roman law had been recovered in the first place. It was important to have these institutions and categories to which you could discipline certain cases that were, however, medieval in nature, that did not correspond to the political and social reality of the Theodosian, later Justinian code, right? And you have, by the way, great names in the Italian 16th and 17th century. We remember Albert Bolognetti, John Peter Molignati, Mark Mantua Benavides, John Baptist de Luca. These were all, for example, agreeing on the fact that Roman canonic law constituted the common law of the central northern Italian regions, and that the fact that it was enforced did not depend on the permissio of the various princes, but only by its nature of right provided with superior and universal authority. Right. This was the way, let's say, that was weaponized at different times, also by the monarchs, to sort of maintain control on this, in fact, superior law, that, however, was just, say, couldn't quite become so because they wanted that, because you needed the means to have it enforced by your own royal justice. And this law had been enforced by just people that, as freemen, were, accepting to have their life disciplined by this law, for how Roman law had been fully now reconstructed, elaborated, and it had surpassed the old juridical system. There was this idea of equitas constituta, that is to say, constituted equity, that the Roman law would have embodied. The maxima rationabilitas, so the top rationale, right? Consider that Roman law, again, had made it out of Italy in the Middle Ages to become prevalent in Western Europe. So, in spite of how it was differently declined depending on this conjugation with the local customs, it was still objectively, yes, much more useful and clear and sort of reasonable law for especially the most developed countries in Europe, right? And this jurisprudence was basically recognizing that, right? And we have seen here central and northern Italian jurists that were the ones of the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. But the same idea was shared, just to come back on the topic, by the southern Italian jurists of the same period. For example, Prosperous Caravita, John Paul Balzarani, Donatus Antonio de Marinis. These were some of the most famous names. And the important thing about this is that Southern Italian juridical tradition was slightly different from the one of the rest of Italy, because they had accepted Roman law themselves, but they had connected the same role that this Roman law had as sort of superior and universal authority, not much to, let's say, this sort of autonomous, sort of customary law, but from the under royal authority, right? There was the Constantinian donation initially, just to say, we've been given this law by emperors, right? But then, within the same Sicilian, say at this point Neapolitan more than else, tradition, and we have seen this with all the laws of Frederick II, etc., and we will come back on that at some point, the acceptation in the South of the rationality and equity because of the royal permissio. In other words, it was conceived like differently from the cities of the north and center that were provided also with this high degree of, so now there were states mostly that had conquered different cities, but let's say the sense of independence in practice, and of direct connection with mostly a universal, in fact, ruler, the Holy Roman one, so the one that had to sort of even correspond to that royal, that universal order and authority, to instead in the South to the royal authority, their own royal authority. Remember that the Kingdom of Sicily was not part of the Holy Roman Empire, so it was just like another thing, like you say, the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of England, and it had it was pretty big, so it had to remain a sort of universe on its own, right? And there, Roman canon law had been observed in virtue of the intrinsic authority that the king had right on it, even the capacity to essentially legislate on the same sovereign basis, right? So adding through his legislative power recognized in the kingdom further law over the one of the local communities. This is again particularly important for two reasons. First of all, because it explains why, of course, Southern jurisprudence was somehow more receptive of external. Of course, there were important jurists that had been. The Neapolitan studium was very important historically, etc. But obviously, in the South, was a much greater obedience to royal authority, right? And this had favored this sort of, and also society was significantly different from the one of the center and the north. There was sort of more mercantile, more entrepreneurial, and people were, generally speaking, it was kind of more per capita wealth. Southern Italy was ruled by the barons in many ways. So what happened here is relevant in function of this, but also still the fact that the same kingdom, so the same king, ended up, given for granted that Roman law was the basis of, say, the same authority that the king had. This is quite fascinating because here sovereigns were providing, say, themselves, right, with an authority that was seen as naturally inspired by God historically. So again, it's something we could digress on more, also because there are other videos made on the topic, and we will surely look at it on some other occasion. But the divides, right, between the various countries, the continent, is quite relevant base of this previous juridical differences, right? So when we look at the juridical culture of the Mos Italicus in the Renaissance, we definitely see a full acceptance of the canonic Roman law as common law fundamentally in all the Italian states. Right? This favored a much greater interaction between the same and also with other countries. And a confirmation of this situation can be offered by the jurisprudence of the supreme tribunals of the same Italian states, that in every case, while keeping in mind the norm of the specific jura propria existing, for the various communities in the various territories, they judge on the same basis of this Roman common law, right? So much so that, as we've seen, the various judges looked at what was happening in the other Italian states, and this would favor this aforementioned homogeneity, right? And so the qualification of Roman law as common law, that is defined very clearly already in the Middle Ages by the commentarists, would have essentially consolidated and found its greater spread and sort of, in absolute terms, right, general and definitive affirmation in the 16th century, right? So again, pretty important chapters of European history. If you've never heard of these topics and you were wondering at the beginning of the video, and I congratulate myself with you if you're right at the end of it for these topics and for my videos in general. Well, I hope at least to have provided you with that sort of basic explanation of why this was such an important issue, at least for this Italian dimension, but also Europe-wide, and that's why we will hopefully cover all the other, especially we have seen France already. We will see Germany and Spain to at least, right? Because we will see also other things. Surely we will mostly cover modern history from now on, right? About this topic from this sort of general introduction, and then hopefully in other videos we will look at more in-depth sort of relevant cases, etc. And again, I've even been working with similar sources of not time, the Middle Ages though, and so it's important to in different times from the early to the late appreciating how meaningful and relevant this this dynamic was, like how did law change and why, right? And why you have all these various developments, why different countries have different traditions, but they also have, as we've seen, so much in common at the same time, especially by the 16th century, but with humanism and etc. But not all, right? You have, after all, a pretty similar basis from antiquity, right? And so when we look at these differences, yes, they are relevant, but always bear in mind that these were, after all, pretty similar societies in their own regard overall. So, well, this is pretty much it for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.